tomorrow.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If we can make welcome to the fifth week public seminar. We'll have a quick discussion as to whether half term it will be fuller or less full than other seminars. Seems to draw a bit of a crowd here and a few more online, so that's good. But it's I'm Nigel Fancourt and I work in the department, but it's my special privilege to present and chair this session given by Steve Puttick on education ETC, future ETC, future education training for climate, spaces, places and knowledges. Steve is Associate Professor of Teacher Education and is Curriculum Tutor for Geography, PGCE and the MSc in Learning and Teaching, and supervises various doctoral students. His undergraduate degree is from Staffordshire University in Geography with mountain leadership. Now, I didn't know mountains needed leadership, but I'm from Kent, so what do I know? And he then did your PGCE here in 2006. Which included an S2 placement at Lord Williams in Tame, which is where actually we first met, sort of 16 or so years ago. He worked and then headed up geography department at Warrener, which is another of the partnership schools within the PGCE here. And he completed a master's in educational leadership and innovation at Warwick. Before returning to us for an ESRC-funded MSc and DPhil in education, looking at geography teachers' subject knowledge. Steve then moved to Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln, 5 years, where he was head of programs, and finally returned to us in 2019 in his current role. So his work very much focuses on the intersection between academic discipline and school subjects of geography, and has worked on various recent collaborations, the Smart Cities Network, Sustainable Urban Futures, work on climate change education, particularly in India, which he's been doing, and various other kind of interesting collaborative kinds of projects with various people, both locally, nationally, and internationally. So Steve's going to speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for questions at the end. Both here and online. So a welcome also to everyone who is presenting online as well. The other thing I want to point out is, because we may have people from outside, fire exit is there hidden behind the screen. Steve, hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks very much for joining us and colleagues online. It's lovely to kind of virtually see you as well. This kind of ETC, well, it was future ETC, and then our names kind of evolved and changed. Owes its kind of origins to one of the two gentlemen sitting at the back here. I don't know exactly who coined it, but thanks very much, James and Kevin. For this, which comes from this hub around education and training for the climate. That's a social science division funded hub that's going to be kind of drawing together people from across the university. And I'll say a couple of things about that and kind of really like an invitation as well to get involved with that. And as part of this, I'm kind of keen to draw on some of the work that we've done, including with some colleagues in the room, some GCRF funded work on climate change education futures in India. A NUFID-funded project, the kind of workshop that began that kind of, for me, bookended the pandemic. It's kind of like early March 2020 in this room. Loads of people, goodness knows what the infection rates were like at that point. And that was the first time that people kind of, to me, it's like stopped shaking hands and stuff. We had a colleague over from North Italy who was going to tell us these stories about lockdown. We're like, no, well, don't worry, it won't be like that here. And then, yeah, obviously, kind of the next 2.5 years happened. I'm trying to take us as well to kind of some different like spaces and places and knowledges. So through these different projects, we already kind of mentioned India, kind of here in Oxford, and there's a kind of important aspect of scale, I guess, to all of that as well, that we're thinking about this thing, kind of the climate, which brings us on to some kind of like massive scales as well. So obviously we've got kind of a really different range of people in the room, and so there's many senses in which lots of this is quite intimidating to say, and thankfully some of our experts, and Gavin has to leave slightly early, so colleagues in the ECI, there's kind of people coming at this from really different backgrounds and with really different kind of levels of knowledge. So just to get us kind of like broadly on and on the same page with this big thing, climate, and a distinction between it and weather. Here's one of those like pithy quotes that, like many things on the internet, get attributed to Mark Twain. We don't think it actually was Mark Twain who said this. We can't kind of pin it down. But this notion that climate's what you expect, weather's what you get. Climate, we're thinking these kind of like big, long trends and averages, rather than weather being our kind of like immediate experience of the atmospheric conditions. And here's a building that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Many of you have probably kind of eaten in there and other things. There's now part of Green Templeton College, the Radcliffe Observatory. And we're going to come back to this building and kind of like look at it from a few different perspectives. I think kind of one kind of story about it to begin with that is useful for this big distinction between weather and climate is the way in which its original function, so when those first kind of foundation stones are laid, 1772, it was set up as an observatory. Like the name's like a giveaway, but it's set up as this observatory, not to observe the weather, but to observe the stars. And so that point, the kind of telescopes and things you'd have kind of up in that upper story, you can see the place where later on things were kind of moved to. But the idea was it was going to be a place to kind of observe these celestial things. By the time the kind of trustees finally gave in and realised that Oxford's skies were too cloudy, it was kind of 1953, and they moved that stuff to Pretoria in South Africa, these kind of clearer skies, so you could get a better view of what's going on. I think this book is kind of interesting to return to because it has been the site of observing the weather as well. So if you're kind of aware of the School of Geography and the Environment, well, no, this is actually the site of the longest unbroken chain of weather recordings in the UK. And so since 1813, they've got daily records of the air temperature. And you kind of see this kind of fact pop up in various places. I think probably the funniest is on Durham's meteorological website. If you go to that and look at their observatory description starts by saying, this, apart from Radcliffe Observatory in Oxford, is the longest running observatory of weather records in the UK and has been going since 1840 or whatever it is. It's kind of like into those kind of things, it's funny. But the way in which this kind of data is then useful to inform our understandings of the climate and kind of starts to get us to some of the ways in which we might come to know this thing that kind of is, in some senses, kind of a completely like vague thing that like eludes our grasp of the climate. One way in which the climate's been represented and that some of that weather data from outside the Radcliffe Observatory has been used is in Ed Hawkins' representations, these climate stripes. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, and his website, Show Your Stripes, so info where you can then put in like a particular city or region or globe that you want to have this data represented. And so what this shows is the variations from average of the 1971 to 2000 average. So change from that average then gets put either as these bluer colours for things that were colder than that average, or in these kind of red colours for things that were hotter than that average. This is the Oxford specific data. And you obviously get this like really kind of distinctive pattern forming, this trend for this kind of recent warming. Another way of representing exactly that same data, but here you can kind of see that line a bit more clearly, that kind of zero line of this average point, and below there, these years that have been colder, and then this kind of like really like striking visually recent warming. To zoom out to a global scale, you get quite a similar picture, and so this is going to show you the kind of global data. Obviously, there's a temptation with a talk like this to just do like amazing infographics that people have produced all night. So don't worry, there's not like loads more of these. But this one takes data from NASA from kind of aggregated across the globe and doesn't just give us years like those climate stripes have, but instead we've got the months as well. So you can see a bit of the seasonal and the month-by-month variation. It's going to chuck on a load of data to begin with from the first like 60 or 70 years, and then kind of go around and keep building from that. This is slightly older average. So the average is 51 to 80. So 1951 to 1980 is the period from which the average has been taken. And then we've got anomalies in relation to that average. So you get this kind of really similar pattern again, but here you've got kind of a different way of representing that same data with this really distinctive warming happening. And there's various ways in which that's been kind of used and has been constructed, but the IPCC is International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has kind of engaged with this, has represented increasingly some of these kind of systems levels complexities. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into lots of the kind of impacts, but I was keen to just kind of use this one image to get a sense of the really kind of holistic nature of the effects of climate change. And again, you can see these different ways in which kind of increasing darkness on the top there, CO2, and then across glaciers, cryosphere, oceans, biosphere, and atmosphere. And there are these different kind of impacts that are then kind of related to this big like correlation between increasing CO2 concentration and other stuff that's happening and interacting. The time when Nigel and I met in 2006, so doing my PhD year, there was a newspaper article that had this person's face on the front of it, and it was saying, "I'm convinced, I'm sure that climate change has been produced by humans." Now, 2006, like it's not that long ago. I think it's almost unthinkable to have major environmentalists saying, "Yeah, I think climate change has been caused by humans." And for me, it's a really good example of the kind of recency of these shifts in discourses and the changes in these kind of norms about what we kind of know and what's like widely held as being kind of true, and the ways in which some of those things have changed. But I was going to read the kind of the slightly longer quote from the piece that he authored in The Independent in 2006. And he says, "I'm no longer sceptical. Now I do not have any doubt about it. I think climate change is the major challenge facing the world. I've waited until proof was conclusive that it was humanity changing the climate. The thing that really convinced me was the graphs connecting the increase of carbon dioxide in the environment and the rise in temperature with the growth of the human population and industrialization. The coincidence of the curves made it perfectly clear we've left the period of natural climatic oscillation behind and have begun a steep curve in terms of temperature rise beyond anything in terms of increases that we've seen over many thousands of years. People say everything will be all right in the end, but this is not the case. We may be facing major disasters on a global scale." There's a few kind of, there's an awful lot obviously that we could kind of pull out of there, but I think one really interesting thing is the way in which here we've got someone who's been kind of observing by that point already we've got kind of 50 years of filmmaking in the environment, huge amount of time spent looking at environments, looking at the interactions between kind of nature and particularly kind of flora and fauna. And it takes then these graphs to make this kind of turning point, this belief that actually, look, this is actually kind of real. And I think it's really interesting that there's not a sense in which that kind of individual observation in those environments was able to lead into a position of being like, yeah, climate change is real and is caused by humans. And there's something really kind of like modern, I guess, about the ways in which that kind of data is talked about and the ways in which he talks about the idea about proof here, this kind of contrast between kind of not having any doubt and proof and this being conclusive. And these really kind of binary terms that I think are quite interesting, and the ways in which he's kind of represented here, kind of chosen him not as a picture of him, but here he's like a cardboard cutout. He's been repurposed as part of this kind of Extinction Rebellion protest and used. And I don't know, obviously there's kind of lots of stuff that we might kind of talk about in terms of the really like racialized, gendered, there's kind of like BBC impartiality that's then waited until this kind of moment of truth where actually we can't kind of be accused of any kind of like bias or whatever. But I think interesting to look at the ways in which as like a kind of character in this story of what climate change is, from 2006 and saying, actually, this is kind of real and is caused by people, through to the ways in which she's then kind of used or has then kind of made more recent arguments. So I just want to play quickly, apologies if you're already familiar with it, but his introductory speech, so this was the COP conference, the one that happened in 2021, COP26, 2021, right? No? Yeah, 22. It's like years of lending. And so this is kind of introduction to kind of open the conference. I'm just going to play the first couple of minutes.
negotiating, persuading, and compromising, as you surely know. It's easy to forget that ultimately, we are only to try and come down to a second law. The concentration of carbon in our atmosphere. The measure that which can determine global temperature. And the changes in that one number is the clearest way to chart our own story, or it functions our relationship with our world. For much of humanity's history, that number felt wildly between 180 and 300. And so too, in global temperatures. It was a brutal and unpredictable world. At times, the first existed only in tiny numbers. But just over 10,000 years ago, that number suddenly stabilized. And with it, Earth's climate. We found ourselves in an unusually benign period with predictable seasons and reliable weather. For the first time, civilization possible, and we wasted no time in taking advantage of that. Everything that was past 10,000 years was able to global temperature has not wavered over this period by more than ±1 degree until now. One of fossil fuels, our destruction of nature, our effect to industry and construction and learning, our release of carbon into the atmosphere at an unprecedented pace and scale.
And so we have this one number here, 414, kind of since then, probably nearer kind of 420 maybe. And this sense of it being an unprecedented pace and scale. Thank you. Is reflected then in the kinds of data that's coming out of stuff. So here again outside the Radcliffe Observatory, this is the weather recording station. Last year, they recorded between July and August 11.4 millimetres of rain, the driest since those records began in 1813. And you find lots of kind of stories like this, of this kind of shift at this kind of unprecedented scale and pace happening. I said that this building has kind of changed its use from kind of being something that's to observe the stars to now kind of to eat and drink and stuff in. And in the Morris Oxford kind of guide to the building and their descriptions of it, they kind of have this lovely way of putting it and say that the building is now less used for observing and is kind of being observed. And they say, but it's no less celestial for that. And I think that in our kind of observing of the building, there's so many different stories that we might kind of tell, stories about this kind of Greco-Roman influence and myths, stories about philanthropy, stories about public planning and politics and so on. But I also want to kind of point us to the stories that the rocks tell, and these stories that stretch back kind of 160 million years. And stories that kind of speak of the changing climate globally and in the specific context of Oxford as well. I brought some rocks, and so I'll kind of start passing around. If you kind of have a little look and observation of them as they're kind of coming around, and just kind of keep them moving. And there'll be some stuff in these for a bit, so you can keep them moving. Kim, that's, oh no, you haven't got the one that we found at Whiten last week, but it's over there. So yeah, do kind of take a moment with them. Kim kindly took a diversion from our PhD trip in Whiten to find one of these rocks, that one there actually. Yeah, that's the one that was kind of just from near this site here. So this is up at Whiten Woods. So we're looking across to, this is like Port Meadow. And then kind of, so I guess the apartment's probably about here somewhere, they're kind of sitting. And then looking up to Headington, kind of beyond there. And there's a few kind of parts of this landscape that I'm just going to kind of draw our attention to. Those not familiar with Headington and places like this, and you can see the kind of road name on there, but Rock Edge is the road name. And you find around Headington a load of quarries. And so it's kind of a nice picture of one of the quarries. If you look at some of the kind of the old maps, you see a lot of kind of detail of various different quarries. And so you can kind of work out the edge of the quarry here. And this band of kind of rock that's being quarried, so Oxford's about here-ish, something, is linked to this kind of blue dotted band, and then this kind of khaki band here. And those bands go right down to this little point here, part of the Jurassic coast we might be familiar with, and kind of head up towards the Humber and so on. And those two different bands there, two kind of rock types, but broadly similar, these like oolitic limestones and things that you've got like a version of there in your hands. So you kind of describe some of the other ways in which they've been used around Oxford. You see these upper columns are from Tainton stone, so out from near Burford. And then the two lower ones from kind of different types of Headington stone. So there's kind of the white plinth on the bottom is kind of hard stone, and then that lower plinth, this Headington freestone. And all of them made with a couple of different types of things. The one that's like shiny that's going around has got some of these things on. So these are uids, like really kind of blown up picture of them. So you see the total size, there's about 2 centimetres, and then a zoomed in version there. And there's one side that's been like cut and then polished, so you can see those things, these uids. And then the other, and particularly this kind of top right one, the one that's labelled number 2, that if you look really closely, and maybe if you kind of use like phone light as well, you can start to see those kinds of things that, I was going to say growing on the rock. Obviously, nothing is growing on it now. It's been going on for a while, but the kinds of things that are formed. And so these were like an ancient fossil, and these are fossilized coral. So it's this kind of stony coral that's been made, and this is a picture from one of the areas in Headington where that coral's formed. It's some really interesting work by this guy, Arkle. And if anyone's kind of into their beer, Nigel's already made one like beer joke, but the beer, Arkle's the same guy. So if you've had like Operation IPA, others, then that's the same. His dad was one of the partners in this kind of small, but like rapidly growing to the extent that then he had loads of money and could just like wander around, like not worrying about income stuff. And you really just kind of, anyway, the kind of the freedom of time, whatever. But some of the work that then going into this paper was that loads of houses, what he calls kind of villas, are being built at the time. And so he used this as an example to be like, oh, quick, can I have a look in your well? Or can I have a look in this cesspit you're digging up? Can I have a look in this? As they're kind of digging down through the strata, and then use this to get this really kind of detailed map of, as you can see here, the coral reefs in the vicinity of Oxford. And you get these brilliant kind of drawings at the back of the paper that then kind of maps out this stuff and shows you where you've got these kind of coral reefs, kind of dark blue bits, these kind of lighter blue coming in these channels, where these different kinds of rocks were formed. And so the rocks are formed in water that looks quite like this. For the kind of calcium carbonate process to happen, there's some science colleagues here, so I'm going to, it's fine. The water depth, we're thinking about 10 meters, like 20 to 25 degrees, quite different to the kind of Oxford of today. But that's the kind of environment that I'm thinking. The stony corals, they rely on these kind of symbiotic relationships with like photosynthetic and plants that needs light. And so we get these things in about 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south. So like tropics is where we're finding coral reefs today. So one of the kind of hypotheses is, well, maybe Oxford was in a different place. Maybe the plates have moved loads. And so those things kind of formed when it was in a different place. But the evidence seems to suggest that Oxford in the Jurassic world is here, which you can put longitude, latitude lines on it. It's about 45 degrees north, I reckon. So today it's about 51 degrees north. And so it's kind of similar kind of thing. And so the question becomes, well, hang on a second. The world must have been in completely different climatic condition. It must have been a lot warmer than it is today. And just some other kind of bits of evidence that then get fed into this puzzle. Here's a colleague from Earth Sciences here, Stuart Robinson, and he's kind of standing, pointing, you can't see obviously, but next to this fossil, a bit of breadfruit. And these leaves are like incredibly well preserved. And again, leading to this conclusion to say, well, it must have been kind of equatorial type tropical climates, mean annual temperature being about -5 degrees C now and needing something more like kind of 25 to 30. And so the big kind of conclusion from all of this is that Oxford in the Jurassic period looked like quite a lot like this, like Bahamas, or maybe like this, like it's taken from Boracay, an island in the Philippines, part of that East Indian archipelago. And so we have this kind of really different sense from those stones on the building, giving this kind of evidence about what Oxford was like and the nature of these kind of changing climates. And I think it's amazing the way in which the kind of fossil record and geological record gives us this really interesting insight into past climates. And it means that we can understand quite a lot about what happens when we change things. So when CO2 changes, we know quite a lot about what happens and the impact on temperature, and then related to all these other different things that are growing. But I think some of the huge uncertainties that also flags up is the rate of change. And so you have a situation now where the rate of change in the last 60 years is kind of 100 times the rate of change of any previous kind of natural increases. And so the related kind of questions about what happens when things change that fast lead to some of the big kind of like concerns and questions now. Particularly through the project that I mentioned on kind of teachers in India and this notion of kind of climate change education futures, we've been engaging with a question of kind of climate change under these kind of assumptions, and I think encapsulated by something that we've used from Tariq Jazil in his work on kind of urban geographies, say that climate change is as epistemological as it is material and real. And so he uses this in what I think is a brilliant paper, The City as Text. And he talks about the city being as epistemological as it is material and real. And he says, look, cities, they obviously are like real. I'm not saying there's not like concrete and things that you can like touch and smell and all the rest of it. He says, but they kind of elude those things and they're more than those things. And what we mean by the city is really significant and has these really significant impacts. And so this kind of notion of climate change being something that's epistemological, partly related to these big questions about like how you can come to know it, touching on those things from these graphs and these like numbers, touching on the ways in which essentially it's algorithmically mediated. And so it like comes into being as an object we can like think about, govern and so on, and through algorithms rather than through something that can be kind of touched and felt in that way. And so I guess all of that is a part of our kind of rationale to understand, well, how do people kind of understand this concept? How are they engaging with it? This project, I guess in some ways is kind of like classic COVID influence and project, and the kind of some of the face-to-face stuff that we were planning then couldn't happen. But we interviewed various teachers in India, having done a survey where we got about 500 kind of complete responses. Our kind of big question was about what discourses about climate change knowledge are being constructed by teachers in India. And so after this kind of survey, we then did a purposive, never say that word, sample of about 48 teachers. And did these kind of in-depth interviews with them. And colleagues in India kind of carried out these interviews, and so they could be carried out in Hindi or in English, and then were kind of recorded and then kind of collaboratively analysed to try and get some sense of the ways in which they're understanding this thing, climate change. These teachers from a massive range of phases, so from kind of primary through to higher education and subjects as well. So it's not like they're kind of like just geography teachers or whatever. And so I would try and give some kind of insight into some of the things in which they're kind of talking about, some of these understandings and this meaning making that they're producing. For me, I think this kind of encapsulates so much of it in this really like deceptively simple phrase. Partly the way in which it kind of gets immediately into these like big normative questions. And so this notion of need is kind of foregrounded. There's big temporal things that are there as well, that there's this kind of immediacy, which, I mean, in one level kind of really jars against those kind of longer term questions about climate and geology and so on. And there's also a kind of like a singularity about it. So it's the need. It's not like a need that we might see alongside other stuff, but like this is the need. There's things that are going to be kind of prioritized, and this being kind of put at the absolute top of that list. And throughout, you get a notion of kind of survival being the thing that kind of underpins that discourse. So this discourse of importance and this shift to kind of a normative view really quickly gets into this question about survival. Here you've also got quite a kind of a holistic sense. So some of the things around kind of these big moral questions and these kind of aesthetic questions as well, and respect. And I like this kind of like rationale and the argument, the kind of, if we're looking forward to survive as a species, well, then this needs to happen. And this kind of question about respecting the planet gets us into some of these kind of like much bigger things that kind of take us beyond that single number that we had that reduction to, into actually, well, this is kind of talking about like potentially anything. And then the kind of curriculum question that comes in. So this thing that's being thrown out, if we need to live and the planet needs to live, then I need to throw out some of the push and learn about climate change, right? It's important. I think this makes me think about that kind of answer that you might give to the Nuffield Review question of what counts as an educated 19-year-old in this day and age, and the ways in which maybe if there's a review like that kind of happening. So that's from a project in this department kind of 15 years ago or so on. And it's almost unthinkable to have a project like that that didn't really foreground these questions about climate change. Again, kind of getting into this question about how quickly some of these discourses have kind of shifted. The notion of consequences and acting, I think, are foregrounded really kind of interestingly here in relation to understanding. And so for me, this is really fascinating because of if we start acting on it right now is first, and then if we start understanding its consequences. And there's a real kind of sense in which talking to these teachers and kind of understanding more about how they understand climate change, very quickly you get to a position where they're kind of saying, well, no, yeah, I don't really know about that, and I don't really know about this mathematical modelling, and I don't really know about that. I mean, it's so incredibly kind of complex and interdisciplinary that how can you possibly know about loads of different aspects of it? And you've got this real kind of like dependence on other people and this kind of epistemic dependence going on. But the kind of the shift between this normative and the understanding, for me, is something that's really fascinating in terms of questions facing teachers who are pushed into these normative positions of, well, look, we've got to get kids to do this or not to do this. Of course, we should be trying to get them to like turn off lights. Of course, we should be getting to fly less or whatever. And that kind of action being prioritized before that understanding. There's a sense in which these kind of questions about understanding are linked to big questions about kind of doubt and uncertainty. And so I kind of mentioned briefly the ways in which in those kind of accounts of climate change being convincing for Attenborough because then there was no uncertainty. The IPCC report that I mentioned, the ARP6 one, if you count through the amount of times it mentions uncertainty in the technical report, it's about 1,600 and something. And then confidence, it's like nearly 7,000 times the confidence is used in that one technical report. And there it's always got this qualifier. So it's low, medium, high, very high. This kind of question, both the kind of scientific question about technical dimensions of confidence and certainty, but also these like heavily politicized questions. And so I flag up and these two examples, partly because of the kind of science and technology studies analysis that's been done on this work, but also as kind of insight into the ways in which this question of doubt and knowledge and certainty has then been weaponized by big oil and others to try and kind of plant these seeds of doubt and say, look, we can't really know, we don't really kind of understand. But really kind of powerful actors who are kind of affecting change both at kind of policy level and in terms of that kind of discursive environment. And one way we kind of framed this, and again, like credit to other people in the room who've been a kind of a part of framing this and writing it, but was in terms of a kind of certainty problematic. You've used this kind of like a heuristic to think about this question, particularly from a teacher's perspective. And we kind of framed that through these two propositions. The first being that we can be certain that climate change is real and is caused by humans, and you can be certain enough to be able to frame kind of opposites to that as like a denialist type of thing. But the second part of that is that all scientific knowledge is like inherently uncertain, and it has this inherent changeability. Necessarily it's designed so that it can be developed and proved on and so on. And like for us, that's not a kind of a simple thing for teachers to have to sit with. And for me, there's like a kind of, the reason I've put this image in the background, so we're back at the top of Green Templeton College Radcliffe Observatory now with Hercules and Atlas, with this kind of like normative holding up the world, but that kind of analytic descriptive, like they can't see it anymore. They've got to like look away. And there's something for me like symbolic about this kind of like problematic between kind of action and understanding. So just kind of a bit more on these teachers through these kind of two questions. Well, how do they then argue for climate change? And where do they go for the information about climate change? For me, this kind of gets us there quite quickly in terms of kind of some insight into how they must know it and how they kind of make the argument. And really it was through this kind of hierarchy of knowledge. And so there was this sense of there being basic knowledge, basic understanding. Just get the basic facts, get the basic information. And then there's kind of a hierarchy kind of becoming more complex or whatever, more specialized. And kind of where do they get it from? Well, online is a massive part of that. And so you see the students kind of getting knowledge from Facebook or some other form. And really the only barrier to kind of to this stuff is just we just need more kind of correct information. There's also this kind of interesting experiential dimension. And so this teacher talked about the ways in which they've realised that the weather's changing. It used to be very chill, but that's totally gone. And there's no sign of any winter at all. And another teacher who talked about the AC breaking. And so they said, actually, look, there's quite a bit of apathy with my students, and I can't get them interested until the power goes off. And then it gets really hot and they're complaining. And the teacher's then like, all right, this is that climate change that we're talking about because it's kind of too hot now. And for me, there's some really interesting questions about this kind of attribution. And I mean, colleagues here have worked with Freddie Otto and others, kind of like there's a lot of complex kind of science going on now about how much you can attribute a specific weather event to climate change. And this is, for me, something that kind of brought lots of those things into quite sharp relief recently. People kind of saw the news about this kind of big chunk of Antarctica kind of coming up. So the red sky on top there locates this more zoomed in thing. And that Halley 6 is the British Antarctic Survey research station. But this west front chunk here, so this is like the size of Greater London. It's like 1,550 kilometres square, it's about 150 metres thick. And it's broken off. It's kind of floating away and breaking up and stuff. And I thought it was interesting the way in which the British Antarctic Survey came out and very quickly kind of had a press release and said, like, basically, don't worry, this is just a natural part of the natural cycle. We were expecting this. And they said then, it was only like a 4-line press release, but they said this is nothing to do with climate change. And it kind of, like, for me, it was a good example of some of the challenges facing teachers. Showing a video, a load of ice breaking off. Like, that's a good example. Look, this is our climate changing. But like with all these things, the kind of scientists is saying, oh, hang on, it's a bit more complicated than that. This is from a book by geologists, Bjorn called Timefulness, that, I mean, the kind of strapline is how thinking like a geologist can save the world. But I thought this is quite a nice way of kind of understanding and expressing that issue about kind of the globe, so these massive kind of global scale things, and then these kind of local issues that then kind of we're asking teachers to involve themselves with. The other question, kind of as part of that, where are they going for this knowledge, was kind of where is that knowledge being produced? And so I just want to say a couple of things about the kind of critique that these teachers have got of what kind of knowledge they're finding and that they're presented with. So on one hand, you get a sense that actually the knowledge they see when they're searching and so on, and when they're seeing news reports, it's a foreign policy issue. So in the Indian context, that's very much about it being a kind of a question of negotiation at the international level. A negotiation from an Indian point of view basically says, no, we shouldn't have total greenhouse gas targets. We should have per capita greenhouse gas targets. So we can get whatever that number is and divide it by like 1 billion. And so that becomes kind of a much fairer way of doing things. But that's what they're saying. So we're not getting this real and local stuff. And then again, these YouTube videos being kind of interesting, but they're only referring to these kind of other countries. So I just want to kind of flag up a couple of things from a scoping review that we've done to kind of make this point about where this knowledge is from. I think one way of kind of showing us some of the massive changes, again, I don't know why, but we're back to 2006 again, so the year that Nigel and I met and the year that Attenborough is publishing that front page of The Independent. This is the share of the population using the internet. So the darker the country, the higher the share, up to 1,000, and the lighter, the lower. I think that's fairly striking, because I don't think 2006 again is that long ago. And I think that the amount of people not accessing things online, I think, is staggering. And then to move it to kind of 2020, again, you see kind of baked in these kind of inequalities in access, and still kind of huge chunks. But the change there, I think, is really rapid and really kind of significant in terms of the production of knowledge. And so you find that places that have had kind of more internet, more stuff's written about, and more of these kind of resources are produced for. Another kind of way in which I just want to kind of illustrate this is through 2 quick Google searches. And so you kind of publish this in this discussion in this chapter. And yeah, the chapter kind of takes a particular approach through kind of narrative. But we wanted to try and get a sense of the information that people were able to access. So we just did the Google search, that a colleague in Pune did the Google search, and I did the Google search in Oxford at the same time. So we've got like our own computers from those like very different like IP addresses located in those particular places. And it's really striking, the kind of enormous similarity between them. So this is a screenshot from a colleague in Pune doing it. They've Googled climate change primary school, and they get kind of 295 million results in 0.40 seconds. The first is this paid advert from the University of Cambridge. Boo, no comedy boos, no. There's some Durham banter earlier. So you have this paid advert, and then you get a Finnish teacher's website, the Teacher's Climate Guide. Next, you get NPR, National Public Radio, non-profit in Washington, DC, 8 ways to teach climate change in almost any classroom. Fourth, the World Wildlife Fund's Climate Change Resources for Schools, so UK-based charity with headquarters in Woking. Fifth is the website of a primary school in Doncaster, single primary school in Doncaster. It's got number 1 on this search from Pune with some summary responses. Next, a PDF resource guide from UN Climate Change Learn. Another PDF classroom resource booklet from a foundation in Ireland. Then a Routledge book, Climate Change Teaching in Primary Schools by an Irish academic. And then a European Union co-funded website. Like the power of the algorithm to foreground certain kinds of knowledges and to kind of invisibilize others. These top 10 results from this search in Pune have this amazing overlap with then the ones that I had. Interestingly, one of the differences I had was that my advert was a side business school climate change education course, 6-week like paid course. But the ways in which this kind of like real like Euro-American knowledge is then kind of foregrounded is one of the big parts that the teachers were kind of saying, hang on, like climate change is different here. I want some different kind of resources. And the ways in which I also got that single primary school in Doncaster. So whoever's doing their SEO is like obviously kind of on it. The last kind of thing that I wanted to say is to kind of flag up this work that we're kind of in the process of setting up and hoping to develop further in the university and then beyond through this hub, education training for the climate. And so through this, really, we're hoping to kind of get together lots of the kind of interdisciplinary expertise that's here and beyond to open up some of these questions about the ways in which education and climate might engage with what hopefully I've given a kind of a sense of the kind of complexity of this issue, and might respond to some of those kind of questions that those teachers have got, but obviously kind of like far beyond kind of teachers as well. So in practical terms, if you're interested, then drop me an email and we'll add you to the list. And there's a launch event coming up, I think 25th of March, so it'd be great to see you there. Otherwise, thanks so much for listening to me, and do pass the rock time if you haven't seen stuff.